So now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Lara Bovilsky, who's Associate Professor of English here at the University of Oregon. Professor Bovilsky coordinated the university's bid to be the sole Oregon site of the First Folio exhibition. And I might add, we were one of the very first ones to open, so we're doubly blessed. She also curated a companion exhibition, Time's Pencil, Shakespeare After the Folio, which is on view in the Knight Library through March 28th. So please be sure to go over and visit that exhibition, and you have a little bit more time after the First Folio closes here to do that. Professor Bovilsky is the author of a book on understandings of race and racial identity in Shakespeare's time, which is called Barbarous Play, Race on the English Renaissance Stage, and has forthcoming articles on radical forms of enmity and love in The Merchant of Venice, on stony but emotional hearts in Shakespeare, and on the study of race and class in Shakespeare. Today, Professor Bovilsky will be speaking about creating Shakespeares, the First Folio and its Afterlives. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lara Bovilsky.
It got turned off. So how is that? Is that a little better? Yes. Great. Okay, so thank you all for coming. That's very exciting. And I want to say that the topic of today's lecture has morphed a little bit. The Afterlives part is going to be a little bit curtailed, and we're going to be focusing more on the First Folio itself today and how it created Shakespeare's. So today what I want to talk about is how the First Folio participated in the rise of English language theater as literature in its own moment. And at the same time, we'll also look at how the First Folio presents Shakespeare as a writer of literature and think about how that created new versions of Shakespeare. And at the end, I'll gesture to some later developments as well. And I'd be happy to take questions on those later developments if there's interest. So for plays to be seen as literature, they would need to be read as well as watched. Literature, I mean, it has the word book right in the word there. But plays were slow in this time to be seen as publishable works. Companies would often sit on the scripts, and theater, as my colleague Ben Saunders talked a little bit about a couple of weeks ago here in the museum, had a complex, and that's a kind of a euphemism, and I'll get to what it euphemizes in a second, had a complex reputation in London in the 16th and early 17th centuries, the period when Shakespeare is active. It was always popular with aristocrats, the nobility and the royalty, who liked being able to have entertainments, especially at their own homes, or places where they were staying sometimes. But if so, it had a far more tenuous reputation among the middle class, the so-called citizens of London, and that's a legal term that denotes people who own property and have certain voting rights in London itself. Why was theater unpopular? It took the citizens, apprentices, and servants away from their work, often. It was a promising place where robbery and prostitution flourished, and also a place where everything from the common cold to the unfortunately common plague was spread. And in addition, for many religious early modern people, both the radical Protestants who were on the rise, but also more orthodox but pious Protestants, its presentation of actors as fictional characters, and even the presentation of the fictional stories themselves, seemed to sanction lying, which was seen at the time as the gateway sin to all vice, the work of the devil, who was known as the father of lies, first of all. So worse, such stories and enactments of fictions made lies exciting and gripping and stirring. And so that was disliked on its own. And in fact, theater was outlawed within the city limits of London. The citizens, not the king, not the crown, or in this case, the prince, who was a queen in this time, the citizens had legal control over nearly all of the city. I can talk about the loopholes and exceptions, which are interesting for the purposes of theater later, if anyone wants. And the theater companies that flourished in this period did so outside of the city, except for those legal loopholes within it. Again, there's some little spaces in the city where theater could happen because they were not considered part of the city. They flourished in large part because of the sponsorship of the nobility, which they reflected in their names. Right? So Shakespeare's company went from being known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men when it was sponsored by Baron Hunsdon, and when he died, it went to his son, so it was just the Lord Huntsman Men, and then he got promoted back to his father's job, so they went back to Lord Chamberlain's Men, and then became the King's Men upon James's accession to the throne after Elizabeth's death in 1603. And it wasn't just the names that marked the companies with these lords' protection, but also materially they were marked, even in their clothing. As special servants to the Lord Chamberlain or to the king, they received livery or clothing as part of their wages, and that was true universally in England. About half of what you were paid in this period was not money, but clothing and cloth. It was a cloth economy. So the livery would often be marked, that is, with special colors and devices of the person who gave it to them. They used to be really elaborate, fancy, colorful uniforms, and that had kind of gone out of fashion, but colors and badges would still mark much livery. So for instance, the King's Men, that is after 1603, every other Easter would receive 3 yards of royal scarlet cloth for a cloak each, and a 1/4 yard of crimson velvet, even nicer, for a cape. And in a world where types of clothing permissible to any given rank or social class were regulated by law, right, so that you couldn't wear clothing beyond your class or station or degree, as they would have thought of it, and therefore identity in theory was ascertainable by just merely glancing at what someone was wearing. The actors were marked off stage as royally protected when they wore their red cloaks and capes. And meanwhile, on stage, they condensed aristocratic protections with a religious irritant, because in the course of every single performance, their costumes would flout those same laws that prohibited clothing above their station, flagrantly participating in the lies that aggravated the devout. And yet this too was authorized. Actors were the only Londoners legally exempted from following those laws that regulated clothing, precisely because it seemed to this culture that they had to wear costumes to perform their art convincingly. But this is kind of a circular argument within the time, because it's only because clothing was so important that it was unimaginable to portray a woman or a king without wearing that person's costume, right? If it had been different in the outside of the theater world, it would have been different in the inside of the theater world as well. We don't need actors to wear special clothing designating rank anymore for their fictions to be convincing. So thus, theater was tied tightly to aristocracy, but it still had, partly by virtue of those ties, it had a kind of provisional status with the citizenry. And the players were not fully sustained by the aristocrats either, financially, because few nobles wanted the expense of keeping up completely a top-of-the-line theater company, but they did want them to exist. So they gave just enough kind of money and legal protection for the companies to be able to sustain the rest of their work through ticket revenues and so forth, and occasionally, as we'll get to, publication revenues, but in a much smaller degree. So if theater's dicey cultural status was certainly the factor most limiting the publication of plays, plays were also prevented from often being published for other reasons. For instance, although this is somewhat debated at present among scholars, companies often wanted to hold on to play texts so that rival companies wouldn't perform those same works. And probably more importantly, there was an overarching sense among the theater people and the culture more generally that theater was primarily experienced through performance. So most plays were never published as books. And for instance, Thomas Heywood would claim, he's a playwright, and he would claim at the end of his career to have written or contributed to, and we'll come back to that, over 200 plays. He says 220. He saw only 20 of those plays go into print. And at first, these factors meant that when play texts first started being published as books in the 1580s, the plays that were chosen were primarily plays that had been popular and much performed, or occasionally a number that additional plays that might raise money if the company needed some cash. So you can see that the companies at first were assuming that people would only want to buy plays that had been really popular when being performed, although that wouldn't stay true forever. So for theater to become seen as literature, multiple things clearly needed to change. The reading market for plays in some way would have to shift from committed theater goings, picking up a copy of something they had really enjoyed watching, to a broader spectrum of society. Or it might have happened differently, right? A broader spectrum of society might have had to see plays as respectable and worth going to and then reading, or a literary spectrum of society would have to see plays as interesting on their own merits. And in addition, another customary theatrical practice is relevant here. So we irretrievably associate literature with the achievements of individuals. And in many ways, when we look at literature, we see most vividly the qualities of individuals, a distinctive style or voice, yielding access to an individual mind. We also associate literature's content with depictions of individuals, developmental narratives of protagonists and their thought processes and the inner lives of major characters, as much as their relationships and affiliations with professions, families, or nations. And literature, of course, tells those stories as well, and at different times, some versions of those stories, thinking about professions, families, nations, religions, have dominated the stories that focus on individuals. But all of these associations post-date Shakespeare's time period, and they were in many ways particularly incompatible with how plays were written and produced and perceived. Plays were largely written collaboratively, so at least a third and as many as half were authored by 2 to 5 playwrights working together. So collaboration when writing plays offered a way to earn a better income. It just works better. You can write more plays if you work with lots of people. The math of that may seem non-obvious. I mean, it isn't a given, but people just get more creative and quicker when they're working together. So therefore, collaboration offered a way to earn a better income. And you could get a fair amount for a play, £6 or £7 from a company, and the highest school teacher's income in this period, or even being a secretary to a pretty high lord, would be about £10 a year, so that's a very good living. It would allow you to get more done. And the practice remains in line with performing arts fields that are most analogous to early modern theater in their central role in today's popular culture, that is, screenplays and teleplays are likely generally still the work of multiple writers, sometimes composing collaboratively at the same time, that is, working in the same room at the same moment on the same maybe keyboard or a piece of paper, and at other times maybe working in stages. So we still have specialists for screenplays or television who are experts at finalizing scripts or fixing problems, and similar things seem to have been true in the early modern period for playwriting. Thus, plays were not generally imagined as the work of a single person, and we're going to come back to that. And indeed, plays as experienced more broadly were associated also, of course, with the actors who collectively performed them. And in the case especially of particularly gifted stars, either lead actors like Richard Burbage or comic actors like Will Kemp or Robert Armin, they became associated with the plays as much or more as the authors. And the ensemble, of course, also embodied the plays. And the copyright systems in place at this time amplified this association of the play with the company in general and not the author, because plays were not the property of those who had authored them, but of the companies who had commissioned or bought them. And this is reflected in the way that early play title pages advertised the plays. So we'll just start looking at some stuff. Oh, apparently I seem to have inadvertently deleted a quote from my text here, but I'll read it out because I think it's interesting. This is a quotation from the Lord Mayor of London about why he hates theater and plays. Sorry, I was curious as I was reading where it had gone, but it at least is in the PowerPoint, so we'll just have it. And he refers to the theaters as some things have doubled the ill, both naturally in spreading the infection and meaning literally spreading infections, plague. They were most obviously, for very reasonable reasons, they were concerned with the plague. Spreading the infection, and otherwise in drawing God's wrath and plague upon us, as the erecting and frequenting of houses very famous for incontinent rule out of our liberties and jurisdiction, right? So those were the things that were north and south of the city, and then in the so-called liberty spaces within the city that were not controlled by the Lord Mayor. So anyway, now I'm going to go to those texts. So these are all very early, the earliest really, publications of plays by Shakespeare. And this one is the first quarto, that smaller format, of Titus Andronicus. So you've got the title, the most lamentable Roman tragedy of Titus Andronicus as it was played by the Right Honourable the Earl of Derby, Earl of Pembroke, and Earl of Sussex, their servants. 1594, what's missing? No author. And this one's a little harder to read, but it's the second edition, really quite a bit later, 16 years later. The most lamentable Roman tragedy, Titus Andronicus, as it hath sundry times been played by the Right Honourable the Earl of Pembroke, Derby, Sussex, and the Lord Chamberlain, their servants. And here's Richard II, going back a little bit in time, as it has been publicly acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants. And Richard III, first edition of this one, a description here. So this is interesting. This is like, what are you going to get? You're going to get his treacherous plots against his brother, the pitiful murder of his innocent nephews, his tyrannical, I can't even quite see that, vituperation twixt the whole conceit of his devilish life and his something death, as it hath been acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants. So this is the way in which plays were published, and what they're advertising is an experience that you have in the theater space, and authorship really of the company as a whole. So in the late 1580s, when plays first began to be published, and that's about 10 years after the public theaters have a really secure status. There's a kind of an early outlier theater that fails in the 1560s, but in the 1570s, the first theater opens that lasts. It's called the theater, which marks how unique it was right at the time. But plays don't get published at all for 10 years, and when they do, this is what they look like. And even in the 1590s, when the market started to grow, so these are all from the 1590s, the title pages of the plays did not include authors' names. Yet that would shift increasingly decisively in the next decade when most plays did have their authors' names on them. We can see it happen. So I've chosen those three plays, Titus and Richard II and Richard III, because they were very, very popular. They were going into multiple editions during Shakespeare's life, so I've created a little chart. And these are the most popular plays during the sort of first half of Shakespeare's career. You can see these are the 5 ones. It kind of gives us an interesting picture of what people liked, either tragic death or English history. Sometimes, well, often, I guess, combined. And then just a really significant number of editions here that go up quite a bit, especially in the case of the histories. So all of these plays have Shakespeare's name on the title page by the second or third editions. So things are starting to shift as you get to those editions that are much later in the 16th century and then into the 17th. So something was in the air. Audiences must have become more interested in the identities of playwrights, making publishers and or the acting companies think it marketable to have playwrights' names on the title pages. And we also start around this time to have a few examples preserved in print of playwrights complaining that the versions of these plays that found their ways into print were not what the writers preferred. So I don't want to wade too much right now, although we can talk more about it in the question period, about the many ways, the details of the many ways that plays might pass from the writer's original complete draft to the publishing house. But suffice it to say that none of those ways was very direct. Many avenues from writer to publisher and then printer would involve changes to the script, because of the work that the actors and company did to turn that script into a performable and performed play, and then to alter it as it was put on repeatedly over time. Some material might be cut, and other new content added by the company as they developed the script. Actors on stage might improvise, and that improvisation, if successful, might be permanently added, and versions written into the script. And the Stationers' Guild itself, and that was the legal guild that governed the publishers, the printers, the bookbinders, and the booksellers, might require changes for publication should the play include prohibited content or language. And what was prohibited was always either politically questionable content or religious content. No other changes were ever required. And none of the changes of that long list was necessarily sanctioned by the writers. I should note, though, that in the cases of playwrights who were actors as well, like Shakespeare or Ben Jonson and others, those playwrights would be familiar with the needs and practices of the company. This wasn't going to be a big surprise that the company was changing things. And for that matter, any successful long-term playwright would similarly be well familiar with this kind of work. So long as the published plays were seen as a record of popular performances whose content was owned by the companies, there was no reason to feel slighted by these changes. And in fact, arguably, the cultural and legal reality that the play belonged to the company and not to the playwright might have meant that playwrights didn't feel any more emotional ownership of these texts any more than they actually possessed legal or material control over them, which is not at all. For us, it seems very weird, but they never lived in a culture. I mean, we're sort of talking today about how this changes, but they didn't know a culture in which the play belonged to the writer. So one of the forms that the development of plays into literature could have taken, but it didn't, was one that didn't feature particular emphasis on the original writer, or as often writers, over and above the performed version of the play. Like, we could have just kept going along this as it was sundry times performed by idea of plays as literature. But as I mentioned, authors' names did start appearing on the title pages, and a few authors were complaining, but not, I mean, just a few, that those versions were not what they might have chosen. So one, Ben Jonson, complained more than most about actors' changes to his works, and also about the fickleness and poor judgment of the audience, which did not always see the value of his best work. Oh, good gracious. Sorry. This is Shakespeare's name now appearing. I apologize for not giving that. You actually now have it, a little tiny script, but tragedy of King Richard III, etc. And it still has, as it hath been lately acted by the Lord Chamberlain servants, and then it says by William Shakespeare. So that's what you're seeing, and the date is 1598. And there's one more of those. Richard II, and a kind of clearer William Shakespeare, and a ruler. Put there on the left for your, your sense of scale. Okay, so here's Jonson from his Ode to Himself. Come leave the loathed stage and the more loathsome age. Say that thou pour'st 'em wheat, and they would acorns eat. 'Twere simple fury still thyself to waste on such as have no taste. No, give them grains their fill, husks, draught to drink, and swill. If they love lees and leave the lusty wine, envy them not their palates with the swine. So Jonson would transform these beliefs about the fickleness and the poor judgment of the audience and the kind of complaints about the alterations to his plays. He would transform them into radical and innovative possibilities for authorship and drama when he published his selected works, when he had kind of enough, and he published his selected works in folio form in 1616. And we, as probably a lot of you know by now, we have an original copy owned by the University of Oregon just upstairs, so I do encourage you to look at this amazing book. We don't, some of the editions have this portrait. I've now discovered why that's missing. Some of the editions have the portrait and some do not. Ours does not. We wound up having it open to a different page. But this is the frontispiece, the title page, the works of Benjamin Jonson. We'll talk a little more about it in a second. It's hard to evoke the sea change Ben Jonson's 1616 folio works enabled. By publishing English plays in the folio format for the first time, he presented their importance as on par with the fields normally dominating that format: classics of Greek and Rome, of all genres, literature and everything else that Greece and Rome produced. Particularly significant works of theology, and I think those forms most of all, but also history and natural history and works by eminent and highborn living individuals. So it was more often to have folio books by the dead, but the living individuals were just a few English language writers at this point, but more often people like King James or other highborn people who were publishing quite a bit in folio. Jonson also revised some of his work just for publication in the book. And by doing so, he bodied forth the idea that he, the author of the plays and poems and court entertainments in the volume, had something valuable to contribute in the form of an authorized version of these works. That we cannot imagine a world in which authors' own preparations of their writings would not possess a special interest and importance owes much to Ben Jonson and this book. In fact, copyright law would not treat authors' words as their own property for for some 94 additional years when the Statute of Anne in 1710 legally vests ownership over writings in authors. Here's a picture of that statute. And it's interesting that the reason that the shift is made is not out of exactly an ontological sense that the works belong to the authors, but a kind of realistic sense that if authors can't earn money from their works, and especially can't be incentivized to earn more money from works that sell better, right, that they won't keep adding to knowledge. So the beginning of that act begins, an act for the encouragement of learning by vesting the copies of printed books in the authors. And it begins, whereas printers, booksellers, and other persons have of late frequently taken the liberty of printing, reprinting, and publishing books and other writings without the consent of the authors, to their very great detriment, and too often to the ruin of them and their families, for preventing, therefore, such practices for the future and the encouragement of learned men to compose and write useful books. And it goes on, so we'll just look at that little part. But what you see there is not a sense of belonging that's intuitive, but actually just a kind of a more social solution to a social problem, is what that is. But that act was nearly 100 years after Jonson's book, and it required many, many additional cultural changes. And thus, Ben Jonson's innovations did not effect a cultural, legal, or literary transformation overnight, but his role in making authors' proprietary relation to the published form of their writing appealing and interesting was transformative here. Jonson was strategic in preparing the volume. He chose his publisher carefully, William Stansby, who was printing works of a high quality, carefully produced, and also particularly known for works of literary ambitiousness, both in Latin and English. Michael Drayton's collected poems, multiple editions, and then also high-profile English language translations of important classical works, which would have been of interest to Jonson. For instance, George Sandys's translation of Ovid, which, by the way, that very edition by Stansby, first edition, is on display in the library right now as part of the Times Pencil exhibit. And also, for instance, the first English translation of Don Quixote, but not long after it was published, so in 1612. So Jonson knows his man. And he placed his plays next to other forms and genres that would have already been seen as literary or culturally privileged on their own. Lyric poems, crafted with Jonson's virtuoso prosody that revived and remade classical forms, and a series of court entertainments automatically seen by the culture as elevated by their proximity to from their proximity to the court, whose philosophy they presented until they were published to the elite alone. Placing plays of the public theater alongside these more rarefied and less popular forms was at once maverick and strategic. As Jonson was particularly interested, so it's particularly surprising because Jonson is most interested in having his plays reflect contemporary slang and dialogue, and he really wanted them to represent the way that real people actually spoke. And also he was interested in representing all levels of London society, from well-born heirs to con men, and the overlap thereof, to women needing to find a bathroom at a public fair, or to the Puritans who appear hating the theater within his plays and getting argued down by a puppet. He didn't like the Puritans. To blue stockings, all sorts of different social circles. The apposition of popular and courtly entertainment was very striking in this book, and it was off-putting to some, but provocative to all. Less democratically cosmopolitan, but also important for his claim to literariness, was Jonson's explicit claim that the book was made for discerning readers only. So on the frontispiece, so going back to this image, right under the title, The Works of Benjamin Jonson, there's a Latin inscription there. On the frontispiece, it offered a slightly modified version of an aesthetic manifesto from Horace, Neque ut miretur turba laboro contentus paucis lectoribus. And this is not the only piece of Latin, even on the title page, that kind of architectural structure is covered with Latin, and there's lots of Latin poems that follow. And that means, and I do not work that the crowd might marvel, being content with a few readers. So his idea of the literary is not populist, but the plays are really populist, so it's a very interesting hybrid there. So Jonson's folio volume would have sparked the idea of the folio. of Shakespeare's works for his friends, Shakespeare's friends and co-shareholders in The King's Men, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, who put it together. And Hemmings and Condell approached their Shakespeare Folio project in some ways quite differently from how Jonson presented himself. For one, they are far more populist than Jonson. They have no Latin poems and quotations all over the title that are all over the title image and the prefatory materials in the Jonson Folio. And in fact, Hemmings and Condell issue an open invitation in the prefatory materials to, quote, the great variety of readers, not Jonson's few, quote, from the most able to him that can but spell, unquote. So really a kind of even almost like fledgling reader of the book, and they invite them all to buy it. And they also seem to have tried to recover a complete set of Shakespeare's plays, and they did get nearly all of them, where Jonson, by contrast, chose the plays he wanted to include for posterity, so he picked the ones that he thought were the best, and he left many out. On the other hand, if he curated his work selectively, Jonson was more complete in including all of the areas of his writerly output in the folio, the poems that he wrote, 2 volumes of poems within there, court entertainments, both masques and other kinds of more marchy sorts of entertainments. By contrast, Hemmings and Condell did not include Shakespeare's lyric poems, neither the sonnets, published just in 1 quarto in 1609, or his narrative poems. Here are Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece, what we now call the Rape of Lucrece, but it's just called Lucrece. And these are the first editions. These are the earliest of Shakespeare's publications in 1593 and in 1594. So how many of you have read these? Yeah, it's some sort of like half raised. How many of you read a little bit of it? It's like, looked at it once, passed through. But the lack of these 2 works, the narrative poems, is particularly interesting because these were arguably Shakespeare's most famous, most popular, and most well-loved output, certainly for readers of books and of English literature. Witness the number of editions of these. So I'm going back to that same chart that I made, and now I've added these early narrative poems, and you can see that really very quickly multiple editions, and they just outpace everything except for 1 Henry's 4 in the number of editions by the time the theaters close in 1642 because of the Civil War. So that's just a startling thing for them to leave out. It's not like they didn't know that he had written that stuff. So by excluding the poetry, Hemmings and Condell identify Shakespeare's eminence, and not incidentally his name, and we would say brand, or maybe we wouldn't, with the stage alone. They create a new Shakespeare by doing that. And that new Shakespeare would endure. The poems would not re-enter the Shakespeare canon as an equal component of it for over 150 years, excluded from all 4 editions of the folio that follow this, and from the vast majority of the 18th century editions that attempted otherwise to recapture Shakespeare's original language. And I mean, I will say, one of the interesting things that I found in curating the exhibit in the library, we found a bunch of books that we at some level that we knew that we had, but they're not in the catalog, so no one really knew what they were and where, we knew where they were, but not what they were. And one of the things I found was very interesting, like little editions of Shakespeare's poems that were sometimes meant to round out a volume of the so-called complete works. So you would have, in 1709, there's a very famous edition, a very important edition published, and it's called the Complete Works, but there's no poems there, and that's not a surprise, because that's how Shakespeare continually will be printed. But someone, and we don't even know who, I mean, it's a rogue publication, just says S.N. as the editor, just initials, created a volume of the poems that is kind of copied from a 1640 edition of poems, includes things that aren't Shakespeare, includes all sorts of things, and reorders them and puts them under headings. And it's meant to be included with that 1709 because it's bound the same way and it's the same size, but it's published the same year. But that was the kind of thing that was happening, and more often they were simply left out. Or they would be printed sometimes in a supplementary volume, and very often excluded from any kind of notes or editorial treatment. So kind of there and kind of not. And we have a whole case of sonnets in that issue in the library as well, in the reading room itself. So not until Edmund Malone's 1790 edition would the sonnets and the narrative poems rejoin their dramatic siblings and be given equal interpretive and literary and textual treatment. When Hemmings and Condell framed Shakespeare as a literary figure, choosing to dignify their own art, the drama, above all, they would slight a significant part of what had been Shakespeare's most popular and admired writing. But for all their differences from Jonson's folio, like Jonson, Hemmings and Condell's First Folio courts a discourse of literary futurity. And this is very important into how it comes to serve as a kind of example of literature. And not least through the work of Jonson's own poetic and memorial tribute to Shakespeare in the prefatory materials in a poem that rather precociously, long before one would imagine this happening, works on canon building for Shakespeare by transhistorical ranking and arrangement. I'll say what I mean in a second. That is, Jonson explicitly values Shakespeare not among the English writers of his own day, but among the more universally venerated classical literary pantheon. So this is the poem, To the Memory of My Beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare, and what he hath left us. My Shakespeare, rise, I will not lodge thee by Chaucer or Spenser, or bid Beaumont lie a little further, like move over to make thee room, but call forth thundering Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles to us. He was not of an age, but for all time. So he's actually saying Shakespeare's better, I guess, than the English writers, but also to be seen as the more valued, much older writers out of history. And I think that's one way of reading this of all time thing, that like the Greek playwrights, and not the Latin ones, Shakespeare will last. So that's one way of reading that line. And note that in the authors that he chooses, like Hemmings and Condell, he's not classifying Shakespeare as a poet of narrative or lyric poetry, both of which Chaucer and Spenser write, but as a playwright. He's comparing him only to those classical playwrights and not to the classical poets. And I think that is an editorial comment of Jonson's. He would have seen himself as much more of an heir to the classical writers, but not Shakespeare. So that kind of fits in with the Hemmings and Condell omission of the poems. But though Hemmings and Condell did not include the sonnets themselves in their collection, the poets they chose, Jonson among them, seem to rifle the sonnets for the sonnet's commitment to the proposition that the individual writer may live on through poetry and writing, and for the writer, that is, through being read in the future. And so this is a different set of excerpts from that same poem, but with one line the same. Thou art a monument without a tomb, and art alive still, while thy book doth live. He was not of an age, but for all time. So you can see this line is also about immortality, and a kind of immortality that comes from a book that's confusingly kind of described as a living thing, right? And the living means being read. And we'll see how that metaphor can get developed in a second, because here's another poem from the prefatory materials of the First Folio by the poet Leonard Digges, who is a translator and writer of Spanish poetry, and his father was the executor of Shakespeare's will. So this is also in the folio. It's a less familiar work. Thy works by which outlive thy tomb. This book, when brass and marble fade, shall make thee look fresh to all ages, when posterity shall loathe what's new. Be sure, our Shakespeare, thou canst never die, but crowned with laurel, live eternally. And I think this is also emphasizing that premise of immortal life by reading. And I think there's something interesting in the idea that the book is actually not really seen as a material object, because it's pointedly contrasted with material objects. Like it's the tomb and the brass and the marble are all going to like somehow melt away, but the book will survive. And so what that implies is obviously not that the book will last longer than stone. Books are very well made, but they're not really capable of that, certainly not something outside, but that it implies reprinting. So it implies that plays will be seen as something that you read. And it's interesting because elsewhere in that poem, he talks about the way that this immortality, the form that it will take, will be in performances of Romeo and Juliet, and he talks about some other famous plays. But the language that he uses for the mechanism of surviving like this show that it requires reprinting. So you're starting to see the assumption that plays would have to be reprinted as a way of their becoming literature. And in a way, the poems like these simply assume that plays are literature. So to that extent, the transformation is affected by this volume if it becomes persuasive. So my next question is, were there costs of the association of plays with literature in this way for drama, costs for drama? The meteoric appearance of Jonson's and Shakespeare's plays in the folio form, and the work of those volumes on identifying plays with an author's individual labor and vision, and at least in Jonson's case, emphasizing the definitive nature of the author's vision, as we discussed for the nature of the plays, work to suppress by omission and distortion that practice and the nature of the theater that I mentioned earlier, and accordingly reshaped how authors were seen and imagined. For, of course, up to half of the plays were written collaboratively at this time, by which there's lots of forms collaboration can take. When we say that number up to half, we mean original drafts of the plays were composed by 2 or more writers. But if we expand the frame of the development of the play into thinking about the development of the performed piece, that is as performed and not as written, it would be more accurate to say that all plays were collaboratively created because they relied on that large production team, actors most of all, but also those creating the costumes and those preparing the scripts, which involved changing the scripts, adding text for clarity and continuity, not just content, but also even entrances and exits and so forth, and those who ran the show. So Hemmings and Condell don't completely omit this vital group of co-authors of the play. Just before the table of contents, they include a kind of second title page, a list of the actors of the company. And this is interesting because they have like a new title, because the book is called Mr. William Shakespeare, His Comedies, Tragedies, Histories, and Tragedies. That's the title of the folio. But here, all of a sudden, there's a kind of weird, different title that looks more like Jonson, The Works of William Shakespeare, and then you get the kind of subheading of Comedies, Histories, and Tragedy. According to their original. And then you have this list, the names of the principal actors in all these plays. So they actually do list them here, although there's what they list are the shareholders, not the actors, but many of the shareholders were actors, or many of the actors were shareholders, I guess is another way of saying that. But even this new title and list of collaborators presents a palpable contrast to those first quarto editions that we saw that named their contents as collaborative, embodied, and a time-limited experience. This is that one we looked at earlier of the Titus Andronicus with no author's name on it, that doesn't have Shakespeare being for all time, or let alone Titus Andronicus being for all time, but rather as it hath sundry times been played. Right? So just a few times taking place in history and now over, and played by specific groups of people also named on that title page. So here, one name hierarchizes the experience. The text is identified with its origins, that word original, and the origins are referred to the single author, and only secondarily with what happened afterwards, which involved these guys. Both in their capacity as actors and as people who ran the company. So this is a kind of Johnsonian format in that sense, because it emphasizes the author over the productions. But one of the problems with this frame, and I don't have time to do more than gesture to it right now, is that the versions of the plays collected in the folio weren't just the versions that Shakespeare first wrote. That is, that idea of the original here, that's spelled in all capital letters, isn't quite true. We have exactly zero reason also to believe that they were final versions of the plays, let alone versions of plays revised for publication and thereby prepared for posterity, as Jonson had done with some of his, and even Jonson didn't do it with all of them. So this is one of the kind of fun things that editors get to do over the years, is trying to figure out where the texts in the folio come from. And they come in a lot of different ways, and I sort of mentioned that earlier, but sometimes depending on how the play, what information is included in the text, you can kind of guess where it came from. Because Shakespeare, when writing, probably, well, we know, did not always include all the information that the actors would need. If he suddenly starts thinking about Ophelia, he can just have Ophelia start talking. He just writes OPH or whatever on the left, and he can just start writing a line. But when they're putting on the play, the actor playing Ophelia needs to know when she's or he's coming on. So you need to enter Ophelia somewhere. And so one of the things that the company would do is go over these play scripts written by authors and add that information. So some of the plays in the folio have almost every entrance and exit. And so it looks like to us that it's reasonable to believe, but not assured, that those versions came through the hand of the prompter and the person who was making the play ready for publication. But other plays don't have anything like that in them, and it seems that those may be more the versions that came closer to Shakespeare's composition, right? So the idea of the original copies that's advertised here on this second title page don't really correspond to what the reality of the plays are. And as we know from the earlier published versions of about half of the plays in this book, and other plays that were published earlier that aren't in this book but are by Shakespeare, that there were often many different versions. So the plays would have been continuously altered, and that could have happened from Shakespeare, and it could have happened from other people. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And so those are also not necessarily the original copies in any sense. So it's also true that even if we are thinking just about the writing and leaving out the actors and companies' contributions with their words and their bodies and their voices, Hemmings and Condell left out the contributions of other writers from this volume. Many of the plays that they collected in the folio, in fact, included the work of collaborators. Like virtually all playwrights of the time, and that includes Ben Jonson, Shakespeare regularly worked with other writers on his work, especially very early in his career. And lest you think that means he was just learning how to do it, which is probably partly true, also very late in his career, Shakespeare frequently works with others. So the Henry VI plays, very likely Titus Andronicus, Henry VIII at the other end of the career, and other plays that Hemmings and Condell didn't get to include in the volume were also collaboratively written. Pericles and The Two Noble Kinsmen. And Shakespeare also had a literal hand in Sir Thomas More, a play seemingly written by two playwrights and then jointly revised by several more. And that play includes 2 or 3 pages that we think are the only play manuscript that we actually have in Shakespeare's handwriting, but it's a very collaborative work. And collaborative authorship is also possible in a few additional plays, still debated, plays like Timon of Athens. And other plays were revised by later writers, but before they made it into the folio. Other writers, when Shakespeare's company might pay those writers to make alterations that could attract return playgoers to old and newly altered favorites. So the best example of that is Macbeth, which includes scenes added by Thomas Middleton that expand some of the most popular material in that play, which was the witch material, and their songs and their dances. And we know that it's Middleton that they picked because he took some songs from other plays he had already written about witches and put them in. So it's pretty clear where that material comes from. All of these text-based collaborations show that Shakespeare was not just for all time, but of his time. And it's also interesting to note that although many of these collaborative plays have had a complex critical reception over the last 100 years, or in a few cases more, that is, it might be easy to say, oh, it's, especially like the Henry VI plays, I'm not going to defend really the Henry VI plays, they're not his finest work. I don't think anyone thinks that they are. So it might be easy to say, well, that just shows us how great and distinctive and unique Shakespeare is, because it's his worst work that is written collaboratively. But that isn't always how it's been seen. Many of those examples that I just listed were among Shakespeare's most popular plays in performance and publication in his own time. Titus, most of all, which was one of the 5 best-selling, most often produced plays in the sort of up through the Elizabethan period, we'll say. Hamlet and Titus are Shakespeare's 2 bestsellers, and then after that, he doesn't make it into the top 5 after that, but with Richard III coming close after. But that same play was hated so much in the 18th century and afterward, until quite recently, now we love it again, that it was excluded from the Shakespearean imprimatur in numerous editions. That is, a lot of authors hated its violence so much that they simply decided it wasn't by Shakespeare, just because of the content. And also Pericles is another good example of that, not in the folio, but actually there's 6 editions by 1642 of Pericles, extremely popular reading text and performed text. But that one sinks pretty quickly after that. And others of that list of collaborative plays include plays that had pockets of great popularity long after Shakespeare's death. Henry VIII is an interesting example because it's one of only a few, very, very few plays that audiences after the Civil War and restoration of the monarchy enjoyed seeing as written. Valued for its pageantry and much performed for generations after 1660, because Shakespeare's plays were not popular in that period. I talked a little bit about that for any of you who were at the library a couple of weeks ago, and you can see more of that in the library as well. And so the plays were systematically and comprehensively rewritten to make them conform to the values of the culture. But Henry VIII was like one of the very few. Henry VIII and the Merry Wives of Windsor was like, this is good stuff, is what they thought. So in no way would Hemmings and Condell have been prioritizing Shakespeare's solo-authored works on aesthetic grounds, because they had every reason to believe that Titus and some of those earlier plays were deeply loved by their audiences. And such rankings and exclusions of the canon on content and form-based grounds would come much later. But Hemmings and Condell, following in Jonson's footsteps, did help form a durable association of literary drama with the efforts of a single person. But even this idea that literary drama must be associated with a single person can be overstated. Because very interestingly, we've talked about the two First Folio collections of plays, but the third great folio collection of English language drama is of a playwriting team. Beaumont and Fletcher, published in 1647, though it's kind of complicated, as you can see, because you've got two names here, but only one guy drawn. And it is indeed mostly Fletcher, and this is a complicated book for a lot of reasons, but this work was much published, Beaumont and Fletcher's works singly together with other writers as well in the Jacobean period, and also far more popular and running through more editions, mostly not in folio form though, throughout much more than Shakespeare in the Civil War period, the Commonwealth that came out. This is actually published during the Civil War in 1647, and the Commonwealth 1649 to 60, and through much of the Restoration in 18th century. And we talked a little bit about that in the library a couple of weeks ago. So that is, our association of literature with the labor and mind of an individual can seem inevitable. And the 1-2 punch of the Jonson Shakespeare folios in framing that can look as though either it had to be that way, or as though those books irretrievably created that association. But by 1647, when the Beaumont and Fletcher folio gets published and many times republished, alternative paths were made possible and viable, and those paths tracked much more fully with the actual writing practices of the theater. And so they suggest that there could have been other alternatives to the single author mode. So later editions would give us still more Shakespeares. The author of additional plays in the third folio, you can see the fourth one upstairs. It looks a lot like this, but it says the third impression. And unto this impression is added 7 plays never before printed in folio. And Pericles is on the top of that list, and it is by Shakespeare, but the other 6 are not by Shakespeare. But so this creates a new Shakespeare in a different way. But always editions gave us newly altered Shakespeares and Shakespeare texts, altered to improve Shakespeare, to return to Shakespeare's authenticity, to expand Shakespeare, to restore Shakespeare. And new formats would do that ever more. The First Folio ordering of his work that emphasized generic division, right? Oops. Well, that's interesting. I meant this. So you have the catalog. This is the table of contents. It emphasizes comedies, histories, and tragedies. So that's how it's thinking of his work. Would give way to works with editors' names on the title page. That's the one that we just saw. So this is an important one. This is the first time you get an editor on the title page. The first time an editor is ever named on a collection of Shakespeare, and it's 1709, and it's kind of hard to see, but it says Nicholas Rowe down here. And we've got a version of that funny engraving that's made a little more low-key, but then it has a crazy statue around it. They just miniaturized it and flipped it. And this edition would give us a new, more orderly Shakespeare as well, because Nicholas Rowe is the first person to comprehensively put all the plays into act and scene division, so they all look very orderly structured, and as though Shakespeare is working with that structure, but since almost none of the plays were in that structure in the quarto form and only some in the folio when it came out, that's a new edition, and it makes you see and read Shakespeare and think about how he's thinking of the story very differently, and that didn't exist until 1709, and then it never went away. And later interests coincident with the rise of the novel and a new fascination with psychology, which extended to the psychology of characters, but also of authors themselves, would reorder the plays chronologically. So this is, says an attempt, this is in the 1778 edition, but it would be in all subsequent editions, an attempt in ascertaining the order of writing the plays attributed to, the order in which the plays attributed to Shakespeare were written, and that's by the very important editor Edmund Malone. And after that, the plays would be reordered, right? So they would now be published in the order that people thought that they were written, and that would give you a different way of thinking about the contents as giving a developmental narrative, which had never existed before, and thinking about an author as having a developmental narrative and having a style that changed or interests that change, and then mapping the genres back onto that order. So then you get comedies history's tragedies as a story about Shakespeare's changing ideas. And in 1877, Edward Dowden says, oh, and then his last phase is when he relaxes in his home and he's hanging out with his daughters all the time, and he coins the term romances. Those are the romances, and we don't have that concept until 1877, and boom, that never goes away. Like, that is just, people love it. And that's a new understanding of Shakespeare as well. So Shakespeare becomes not just plays, but something to be understood textually and historically. So just as Hemmings and Condell's Folio had done, the shift of each new format, ordering, and editorial apparatus, right, all those things that are in the book but are not the book itself, over time led not just to new versions of the plays, as every edition and every performance always has to, but to new ideas about and understanding of Shakespeare, new Shakespeares. Thank you. Sorry to go late again.